Hunslet and the cholera epidemics of the 19th century, a community's response to a pandemic. Almost 200 years ago, a terrible disease called cholera reached the parish of Leeds. Little was understood about this horrifying illness, which, rumour had it, could infect a perfectly healthy person one day and then turn them blue before they died the next. Nicknamed the King of Terrors, it led to widespread fear and panic. It was unclear how it spread, but it was believed that foul or night air was to blame. And so people were urged to be clean, whitewash their homes, use chloride of lime, help to clear up the filthy streets and deal with their waste sensibly. The poor were particularly vulnerable. It seems apt then that I should be lecturing on this topic when we are all suffering from the effects of a pandemic. Society is having to deal with a new disease about which little was known. It's led to government encouraging us to clean up our act by using hand sanitizing gel, antibacterial sprays on surfaces, and even having to wear a mask in public areas. And today, the poor are still particularly vulnerable. But first, let us learn more about Hunslet, because many listening to this lecture will not actually be familiar with the place. Hunslet is located to the south of Leeds and formed part of the parish and borough. In 1781, when Mr. Teal came to Hunslet to make this map, with the onset of industrialisation just beginning, it shows very much an open rural aspect. But this plan disguised the fact that there were many people, clothiers and colliers, working in this environment. The main street, here marked in a turquoise green, was Chapel Street, and it was located running from the moor down to the fording point across the river, where you could then join the York Road on the opposite side. There were other little hamlets. The blue was Woodhouse Hill. The light green was Hunslet Car. Black, Hunslet Moorside. And Hunslet Hall is marked in purple. But the red marker is about that linear development, the expansion of the central in township of Leeds, where the merchants and wool staplers were beginning to build their fine houses. Those who think about Hunslet at this period will no doubt immediately be thinking of the Leeds pottery and its famous pierced-ware, which was made from the 1770s onwards and exported all over the world, from America to Russia. Or it may be the fact that it was the wonderful wagon way, which had been created by Brandling in 1758 to bring coal from Middleton down into Leeds. And the fact that on that wagon way, the world's first commercially successful railway had been created, where Blenkinsop had made a two-cylinder geared steam locomotive, which you can see in the background here of Walker's wonderful view of 1816. One of the great things about the Thoresby Society is the fact that it has a marvellous collection of pictures, paintings, watercolours and prints. One of my favourites is this one of Hunslet in 1840, a Frenchman called Alphonse Dussault. The reason that Hunslet was chosen was, of course, it was one of the world's first industrialising settlements. And what this view shows is, the right of centre, you've got Bowers Glassworks, which was manufacturing not only window glass, but also glass bottles for everything from sulfuric acid right the way through to beer. To the right of it, you've got the cotton mills, the wire works, the vitriol works, and the fulling mills of Hunslet. To the left, the woolen mills and the potteries. And in the foreground, the market gardens, where the people of Hunslet had the produce from these very lush, very fertile grounds. And of course, part of that went to Leeds Market. So what we have here is a really good view of what it looked like when the cholera epidemic was to strike. But as you can see from this picture, despite the fact you have the hamlet spread out, there are these very tight clusters of settlement where the housing is literally very tight. So you've got poor, cheek by jowl with the rich. And the population of Hunslet burgeoned in this period as people came to the place looking for work in these mills, foundries, wireworks, and potteries. So in 1775, the population was only 3,825, but by 1801, had risen to almost 6,000. It was bigger in size than Dewsbury, Pontefract, Wetherby, and Barnsley, and was almost the same size as Wakefield, Huddersfield, and Halifax. But because of cheap coal, industry prospered, and yet more industries were attracted to the area. And as they opened their doors, they needed more labour, so more people were drawn in. In 1831, just before the pandemic, the population is about 12,000, and yet it leaped by 1851 to almost 20,000. So in 75, 76 years, there was a five-fold increase in the people living in Hunslet. And unfortunately, housing couldn't keep pace, so overcrowding became a huge issue. Hunslet was a place of contrast. There were very rich merchants living in fine houses like this. This is Burton House, which still exists today in Hunslet. There were also magnificent residences, huge, like Grove Cottage. What a misnomer. This magnificent house, which those who know Hunslet, if you look where it says church, that's now Morrison's and Penny Hill Centre in Hunslet. So just down from the road for that was this huge mansion with its stable blocks. And it looked over an absolutely beautiful kept lawns. And that garden had its hot houses, it had its summer house, it had a croquet lawn, and it extended down to the bottom where there was a magnificent, what looked to be a lake, but in actual fact was the pond which fed the mill at the bottom, the cotton mill, then originally called Barmbek Mill, but later known as Waterloo Mills, which actually features in our story later on. You've got other families wealthy, like the Crosslands living in Leafley House, or this gentleman, the Goodmans, a thriving family, originally wool staplers, but they then went into all kinds of business, everything from being involved with the railways to business rescue programs of woolen mills, etc. And here we've got Benjamin, who was the first mayor of the Reformed Corporation, and he was living in this house, Sundial House, which is or was located opposite where Costco is today. And so magnificent was the lifestyle here that to the left of the centre you see an extension, and that was Mr. Goodman's ballroom. Now these rich people took their responsibilities very seriously indeed, and they wanted to be fair to the poorer members of their society. And so in 1824, they employed Henry Teal to do an assessment and a plan of the township of Hunslet so that they could ensure that the poor had enough money. Now, this record was very important because the plan that went with it really does show what Hunslet was like at that period just prior to the onset of cholera, and it highlights the issues. You can see there Waterloo Mill marked that we just talked about, and you have marked Penny Hill Morrison's for those who know Hunslet today. But what you notice on Church Street is that in the alleys behind you had these long sections of working class houses. They had no piped water, they had no effective sanitation, and often they were single-storey buildings, like this one here in Rattan Row on Penny Hill, just off Chapel Street. And these were one-room houses, 12 feet square, built of brick with thatched roofs and with rough stone used for the chimneys. They did have glass in their windows, but on a night the shutters were raised to keep out the light. But again, there was no water and there was no proper sanitation. The frontage of those streets I show because what you can see is those houses were much older. They were 17th century and 18th century properties. Some of the new houses that were built were back to back, but in very long terraces. And so long were they that, of course, people had to walk a considerable distance right the way to the privies, which were located behind where the washing is here, and the middens where the waste was taken. So here we have really a public health disaster. You have all this waste, all this rubbish, people not having clean drinking water, people in overcrowded dwellings. It's a disaster waiting to happen. And of course, the cholera outbreaks of 1832 and 1834, which led to 55 deaths in Hunslet, were dreadful. So what is cholera? It's an acute infection characterized by nausea, vomiting, frequent yellowish watery stools, colicky pains, and severe muscular cramps. It leads to rapid and severe dehydration, shock, collapse, and skin wrinkling. And terminal patients have an almost skeletal appearance, and the face and peripheries become blue. It almost certainly originated in the Indian subcontinent and had caused many deaths amongst British troops in India in 1817, and then it progressed steadily across Asia to Europe, reaching the Baltic ports in 1831. England's first case was reported in Sunderland on the 1st of November that year, and just to scare everyone even further, actually published a picture of the victim. And you can see how dreadfully blue this person looks. She looked shocking. So of course people were frightened. But how did the disease spread? At the time, the miasma theory held that diseases such as cholera were caused by miasma, or a noxious form of bad air, also known as night air. The theory held that epidemics were caused by this, emanating from rotting organic matter. So if you removed the organic matter and you removed the smell, you stopped the disease from spreading. The Leeds intelligence on the 5th of April said that cholera had reached Goole. Now, Leeds had very strong trading links with Hull and Goole, and so this really did start the alarm bells ringing. They reported that pestilence has gained a footing in Yorkshire. Goole was only 40 miles away. And there were overland coach links as well as the waterway links, and there were constant vagrants on the tramp via the towpaths and roads, again a potential problem. By the 14th of April, no vessel was to leave Goole without a clean bill of health, but that didn't stop cholera reaching Leeds on the 28th of May, 1832. And I put this picture on because we forget that the river was the motorway of the time. The air and Calder navigation was packed with river traffic. And this bit later view by Atkinson Grimshaw, though, does show the vessels packed with goods coming from the Baltic, the flax ready to be spun into yarn, the timber ready for building. Now, amongst the jewels of the Thoresby Society collection are a whole series of plans for this period, including this wonderful one by Fowler for 1831. And I've just annotated it to show you how it looked at the time when the pandemic broke out. The M showed you where Morrison's is. You can see there to the right, Waterloo Mill. You've got Larchfield Mill, near where Costco is today. Bowers Glassworks, the Workhouse, the Pottery, and of course the famous Wagon Way of 1758, which brought coal from Middleton into the potteries and then across to Leeds. The people of Hunslet were really very well led by the elite that was still living there at the time. They set up a board of health and were proactive. They had a survey of the habitations of the poor in order to ascertain their cleanliness. It took 14 days, and members were shocked at the distressed state of many families and started a fund out of which their suffering neighbours might be relieved. All dwellings of the poor were whitewashed and cleansed. Lime and brushes were distributed free of charge, and the board purchased 450 blankets and gave them to the needy. 2 doctors, Messrs. Beckett and Gisborne, were employed to attend the sick and dispense drugs. And the middle-class ladies of Hunslet undertook personal visits to the sick. They made shirts and shifts and waistcoats and petticoats for the destitute and needy. Now, Hunslet was like many other places that were having boards of health set up. But whereas the ones from Hunslet were very effective, many of the others were led by members of the clergy, and they were lampooned at the time because they were saying that, well, why is it taking a pandemic for you to be absolutely sure what the poor were living like? So this cartoon shows them for the first time in that. But let's look at the reality of Hunslet. This is off the main street, Chapel Street, and this is Finlay's Yard. And look at the dwellings in which these people were crowded. Often 10 to these one-roomed dwellings. You can see that they're single-story, brick-built with a stone-thatched roof. But what you also note is those externally whitewashed walls show quite clearly the terrible damp that's there. These yards are unpaved. There is rubbish strewn in the yard. And to the left, by the large pole, of course, that's where the privy and the midden are located. Now, if cholera strikes, which it did, where do you bury these people? Well, the chapel at the time, Hunslet Chapel, had already had its chapel yard extended twice. But when the Board of Health went to inspect, they found that St Mary's Chapel Yard were found wanting. 5 square yards could not be found in which graves could be dug, more than 3 or 4 feet deep. And so the board appropriated 200 square yards of field number 31 on Mr. Teal's survey near the workhouse, in which it was found that graves could be made 10 feet deep, in which, without distinction of rank or station in society, the bodies of all those who died of malignant cholera within the township were to be interred. And here we have a rare shot from the Leodis collection showing that graveyard being tended with the 55 victims who died in 1832 and again in 1834. But the rich of Hunslet took their responsibilities very seriously indeed. Joshua Bower, who owned not only the glass works, the vitriol works, the glue works, but also the collieries, where he employed over 1,000 people and owned all the tolls from Leeds to London, a multi-millionaire, he and his son still lived in Hunslet, and they really were concerned about what was happening. And so they gave away 4,000 portions of chloride of lime to purify the dwellings of the area. I love the instructions which came with it. Place contents in a glass bottle to make a liquid. Sprinkle on the floor, and a tablespoon of the liquid should be put neat down any crevice, drain, cesspool or water closet to get rid of any noxious effluvia. Place the bottle containing the liquid in the main room without the cork on, so that the fumes will evaporate until the desired effect is produced. I'm so glad I wasn't in that room. There were also very able people working for the Board of Health. John Noodle had once been the toll collector on the Turnpike Road from Leeds to Harrogate, but had moved to Hunslet and took up his role as secretary in 1832, and he did a superb job and was rewarded amply, as we shall see later. On the 1st of August, he argued that more money was needed to alleviate suffering and pay for another doctor and more medical care. At the November meeting, he stated that the cholera was still in the township throughout September and October. But I think very interestingly, what he said was that the nature of the disease was changing. It had become in a more malignant form than before. As a result, 27 out of the 50 people identified with the disease had perished. 46 had already been buried in that new graveyard. This was not cheap. Management of the crisis had already cost the ratepayers of Hunslet £300, and Noodle received another 250. Thank goodness the cold weather in December 1832 stopped the epidemic, but it was to return 2 years later. Now, for those who know the history of Leeds in this period, you will know that Dr. Robert Baker, produced, with the help of Charles Fowler, a superb cholera plan of 1833, which highlighted where cholera had been most prevalent. What we can see here is that it didn't come as a surprise that in Hunslet, Chapel Street was probably the worst. Waite Gate, where many of those that worked on the rivers or were connected with the trades like cobbling were located. Little Hunslet, the potteries, again, where people are living close together, and opposite Larchfield Mills near the Costco site today. Those were the main centres of cholera in the 1832 pandemic. Now, Robert Baker's report said there were 702 deaths in Leeds. He was still convinced that the miasma theory was correct. But 755 cases of cholera had occurred in streets that were lacking in sewerage and paving. He recognised that overcrowding was an issue, but he did not appreciate that it was drinking water that was the problem. He believed in the miasma theory that if you eradicated the foul air, you'd eradicate the disease. This conclusion was not lost on the Hunslet board. However, once the pandemic was over, what happens? They do nothing. The Board of Health ceases to exist, and no improvements are made to housing or cleanliness. So it's no surprise then that in 1849, when the population is 17,000, it once again returns, but this time it's far more serious. There are 884 cases, and 1 in 40 of the entire population of Hunslet died of cholera. They should have seen this coming. Smith had been sent by central government, who were worried about the states of the towns in the country, and his report on the condition of Leeds in 1845 makes grim reading. Basically says that on the opposite side of the river from the main town, stretching towards the west, there exists an extensive flat on which a considerable extent of buildings has of late times been erected. The chief extension of the town is now taking place in that direction, called Holbeck and Hunslet districts. This flat is traversed by 2 brooks which form the natural main sewers of the district. The flow of water is, however, retarded by various artificial obstructions, which cause frequent overflowing of the ground and at all times retain masses of putrescent matter in the channels of the brooks. Revolting, revolting. The Thoresby Society has within its archive collection the draft book on the history of Hunslet and all the notes of this gentleman, John Killingbeck. And he and his father lived through that epidemic of 1849. And so they can write authoritatively about what it was truly like. And this is his description of the housing problem. The houses were back to back and generally very small, regardless of the number in the family. We knew many instances where it was common for 6, 8 or 10 to occupy only 1 bedroom. A large open midden with a closet for a dozen or more families with no inspection did much to pollute the air. Every street, alley, yard or fold as they were called had its open, nasty, filthy gutter, wide or narrow, and in many streets 2, 1 on each side. This filthy condition caused many letters to be sent to the public paper, not only condemning them, but attributing to them the aggravation, if not the origin of cholera in the year 1849. He goes on to say another yard called Gordon Fold was revolting. There were 10 houses here. In this fold, there were large barrels in which urine was collected. Periodically, a man went round with a horse and cart to pick these up, giving a copper for each of these large bucketfuls as urine was used in the cloth washing the fulling mills. This was a sort of revenue divided amongst the neighbours. But when the sediments of those barrels were disturbed, whoa, the stench of poverty permeated everywhere. And that's just to remind you of what he was talking about. This was Finnish Yard revolting. Also, what he refers to, Killingbeck, is what was to happen at Hunslet Feast that year of 1849. The absolute highlight of the year for working class families in Hunslet was the feast, because what you could see here were the Punch and Judy shows, the cheap drama stroke theatre, all the wonderful swing boats and slides, the brandy snap stalls, the orange stalls, the toy stalls. There was a real buzz. But in Hunslet Feast that year, which was held on the 12th and 13th of August, John killed the commencement of the disease, 184 deaths. Those listening will no doubt remember the current government's announcements on the weekly progress of the COVID-19 disease. He also recalls that local officials were working hard, providing every means of sanitation, including lime wash and brushes and disinfectant. The thing is that Mrs. Pullen and Brooke and Gisborne, who'd been there in 1832, were very brave because they valiantly entered the homes of victims at great risk to themselves. The Board of Health also provided brandy, arrowroot and beef tea to strengthen the resisting powers of the system. Let's just look at one of the great manufacturers, the great mills of Hunslet at this period, because it really shows the scale of these industries. This is Hunslet Mill. The building still exists today. It employed 1,600 people in the flax spinning process. And it had been created in 1838 by John Wilkinson. Now, unlike many of the Hunslet elite who felt very sorry for the poor, Wilkinson didn't. And he said, well, no one died of cholera except the very poor or those who were very dirty. And the irony of that comment was, within a few days of that injudicious remark, he fell victim himself. Oh, how wonderful it is, how the mighty had fallen. Now, boards of health were very variable in how effective they were. And I think what's fantastic was the Hunslet Board of Health really did do a first-rate job. But it too was struggling with how to cure the people. This great Crookshank cartoon shows the poor starving person, the victim who's got cholera, struggling to know whether it's the blue pills or the emetic that he's supposed to be taking. Now, cholera in Hunslet, the cholera victims were very fortunate because there was someone there who really did make a massive, massive difference. Salvation came in the shape of Captain Waterton, who lived with his wife here in this beautiful house just off Chapel Street, Waterton Hall as it became known. He was a former military man who travelled to the West Indies to treat those suffering from yellow fever. And he actually discovered a remedy for those complaints. In 1831, he'd used that same medicine to treat patients with cholera who were in Moravia, now part of the Czech Republic. Very fortunately, in 1849, he was in Hunslet. He was an investor in Waterloo Mills. And he started to make his cholera powders there and distribute them free of charge. He gave away 30,000 of these packages. He was naturally viewed locally as a hero, a nice, fine-looking military gentleman, a man with whom the public had enormous affection. But someone at the Hunslet Board of Health decided that these powders had been the means of preventing other remedies from acting effectually. So Waterton said, okay, fine, not a problem, and put a notice on his door stating that he won't make the powders any longer. There was an absolute outcry. And so on the 16th of August, the bellman of the township of Hunslet was sent out to deliver a notice of a public meeting to oppose the decision of the board. Edward Hardesty, its chairman, wrote a grovelling letter of apology to Waterton and denied that the board had authorised anyone to recommend discontinuing the distribution of the powders. So Waterton resumed manufacture and made another 80,000, which were out there. But his contribution didn't stop there. There were so many people with cholera, they were trying to isolate them, put them together so that the disease did not spread any further. So they needed a hospital. Now, when Leeds had tried to have a hospital for cholera victims in the St. Peter's area, Corey Hill area, there had been mobs gathered outside that building in 1832. They bricked the windows. They stopped people from going in. Rumour has it that the cholera victims were being sold to body snatchers, and that their bodies were then being used for medical for medical purposes, so that they would then dissect the bodies. So there was a whole stigma attached to this. And of course, most people didn't want their property to have cholera victims in, because if they then tried to sell it further on, it might depreciate the value of the property. But he very kindly gave his mill, a floor of his mill, for use as a cholera hospital. And we're very fortunate that in Thackeray Medical Museum, the matron's book for the hospital for 1849 still exists, and it gives remarkable detail as to what was happening in there. It records that the first patients were admitted at 4 o'clock in the morning on the Wednesday, the 22nd of August, 1849, when Mary Hutchinson, a 66-year-old domestic servant from Hunslet Car, came in, closely followed afterwards by Mary Pemberton, a 62-year-old domestic servant from Bowers Glassworks. Under the skilled hands of Dr. Pullen, Hutchinson was discharged cured a week later, and Pemberton followed on the 19th of September. But then what happened was, we know how these patients were treated. When they arrived, they were stripped. Their clothing was put in a bag. It was then sent out to a place called the Dancing Pogs, a very isolated part of Hunslet Moor, where furnaces were built, and these clothes were then burnt on it. As they're burning, there are cauldrons of water put on the top of it, which are boiling, and soap is put in there, and women are then paid to wash the sheets of the hospital inside there. And these women are paid not only a good wage for doing this vile job, but they're also supplied with brandy to keep them happy whilst they're doing this work. So we know that the bedding's being kept very clean. We know that the infected clothing is being burnt, and they're doing everything they possibly can to help these poor people. There was a steady flow of cholera victims admitted to this hospital. They came from the worst insanitary areas. Those I showed you earlier, the Thwaite Gates, the glass houses, the moorsides, where the disease flourished. These, just to remind you, this arrow shows you where the cholera hospital was in the Waterloo Mills, and how close it was to the worst housing of Hunslet on Chapel Street here. Altogether, 73 patients were admitted before the hospital finally closed its doors on the 24th of October 1849. Out of those, 36 were cured, 36 died, and 1 walked off without leave. But there were some tragic cases recorded in that matron's book. There's Brock Wills of Glasshouse, a glass maker. He was admitted at 10:30 in the morning after burying his wife and 4 children from the hospital. And he then died at 11:30 that night. Very sad, very worrying. What you had then were places like Organ Fold, and this is the house where the Perigodes lived. And they too were admitted to this hospital. And all bit by bit, people were beginning to realise that there had to be something more than just dirt and filth. Now, at the end of the pandemic, and again it was the cold that stopped the cholera epidemic, Captain Waterton reflected on what had happened during this period, and he wrote a book on it, which is fascinating. He writes, the timely distribution of medicine amongst the working classes and the poor should take place before the disease took root. And a hospital should be prepared and ready before, not after the epidemic has carried off hundreds of the population. You can see the parallel with what happened in our country during the current COVID-19 pandemic, where, of course, they were proactive with the government and did have those Nightingale hospitals created. But this next bit, I think, is really significant. He argued that Hunslet had been stigmatised as dirty and unclean, and that much evil was felt throughout the township to arise from the throwing of filth upon footpaths and the accumulation of refuse matter near to dwellings. He urged every man and woman to change their habits, and he told them straight that they must not trust the magistrates or police or town councils, but they must remember that society general would never be efficiently reformed until all the units which was composed reformed themselves. Now, Hunslet people were so grateful to this kind man that they started a collection for him and his wife. They even wrote to Sir George Grey, the Secretary of Board of Central Government, asking for a donation so that they too acknowledged the great work. They eventually collected so much that they decided to make a really big thing of it, and they dressed up the National Church School opposite his house as the venue. And on the 12th of February 1850, it was decorated with huge banners which said, "I was sick and he visited me. See the Good Samaritan. Blessed is the man that remembereth the poor." The Mayor of Leeds came, Joseph Bateson, Alderman Bower was there, the Vicar of Hunslet, and they presented him with a splendid silver salver and a purse containing £280 in gold, a fortune. They even gave him a silver snuff box which was engraved, and a gold bracelet with valuable rubies for Mrs. Waterton. It said, "Presented to George Edwin Waterton, a purse of £280 by 3,000 subscribers. 12th day of February 1850, as a token of their gratitude for his gratuitous distribution of medicine, unwearied labours to the public, and also to the voluntary loan of his premises as a hospital." How fantastic was that, and well deserved. But the other person to be acknowledged was John Noodle, the secretary, who had never stopped. And he was given this fantastic silver teapot, now part of the collection of Leeds museums and galleries, and he too was rewarded for his sterling efforts. Now, what frustrates you now is that you know what the problems are, you know what the issues are. You would have thought that something would have happened, but no, a lack of action. The Act of 1837 had given Leeds Corporation the power to provide piped water to everywhere in the borough. But there were constant delays and arguments over the form the company should take, and this delayed people getting clean water. The Improvement Act of 1842 had given Leeds Corporation the powers to cause such common sewers, drains, vaults, culverts, water courses, wells and pumps as they may think necessary to be made or constructed in or under any streets within the limits of this Act. But again, there was dithered. 4 years go by before John Wignall Leather's proposal was adopted, which led all untreated sewage into the River Aire. But again, why the delay? 1848, there was a Public Health Act which set up the General Board of Health, but there were no improvements. So what you're left with is no surprises at all. Cholera returns in 1854, but almost isolated. There were an odd case outside it, but Hunslet Flax Mills was the worst, with 40 cases and 50 deaths. Just to show you where Hunslet Flax Mill is today, you've still got here, coming down here, Hunslet Road, and here you've got the great flyover, the Royal Armouries towards the top, the River Aire here. But you can see Hunslet Flax Mills, which still survives today, and Victoria Flax Mills, again, which both survive. This is where that 1854 pandemic was. Now, these mills had been built brilliantly to the designs of this gentleman, Fairbairn, William Fairbairn, the great Scottish engineer based in Manchester, who had been employed to build the best possible flax mills. And this is what he constructed. And they were absolute state of the art. But of course, when it was so isolated, the central government were intrigued as to see why. And they sent William Lee, Superintending Inspector of the General Board of Health at Westminster, up. And his report of the 21st of March 1854 makes interesting reading. After observing that the river was heavily polluted and the water almost stagnant by Hunslet Flax Mill, he notes, about 150 yards away from the mills, on the other side of the river, under the foot of the suspension bridge, is a plot of ground about half an acre in extent, used by Leeds Corporation as a depot for the solid refuse of the town. Upwards of 1,000 tons of street sweepings, ashes and night soil, the filth from the toilets, was waiting for removal for agricultural purposes. He stated, the stench was appalling, but the matter was entirely out of the hands of Wilkinson. I just put this map on. This is the 6 inch to the mile 1851 OS plan, which shows you the location. This is the suspension bridge where the store was, and just downriver are the Hunslet Flax Mills, and here the Victoria Flax Mill. But his report really does get close to what the actual problem was: polluted water. He noted that there were 56 water closets on the premises, and the waste was emptied via the drains directly into the semi-stagnant river. The mills had two sources of water supply: the river and an artesian well, but 7.5 times as much water came from the river. So they pumped this sewage-laden water from the river through 3 pipes. And this was taking water not just from the river, it was taking it from a position located between 2 outfalls of sewers. They then pumped this onto the floor of the mill and created steam. So this steam generated from this polluted water was done to stop the flax threads from breaking. That water was stored in open, shallow troughs attached to each machine. Now, what was very noticeable was Victoria Mills was a flax mill, but there weren't any cases there. But they got their water from Leeds Corporation. So you can see that they're beginning to get there. Just to remind you of the location, Leeds, this horrible, vile store of privy filth. Hunslet Mills here taking vast quantities of river water, and Victoria Mills here with town water. This, of course, is Victoria Mills, just recently restored beautifully by JN Construction. So, Wilkinson is devastated that his mill is the one that's got cholera, and it has a huge impact on him personally. He's moved away from Hunslet, living north of the river, but he dies the year afterwards, quite tragically, very sad. Now, what improvements needed to be made then? You needed clean drinking water. You needed the houses connected to the sewerage system. You needed better quality housing for the working classes. And there was a growing acceptance in Hunslet, where most of the rich now had left this heavily polluted area, and they'd moved mainly to areas like Headingley, Potternewton, Chapel Allerton or Roundhay, in the leafy suburbs of the north. So you're diminishing leadership in Hunslet. You also needed somebody to be on the ball. And in 1866, at last, 12 years after the last of the cholera in Hunslet, Leeds appoints its first officer of health. Liverpool had theirs in 1847. And eventually we get building bylaws coming in with the Leeds Improvement Act of 1866, where the maximum number of houses is 8 in any block, and they have piped water and proper privies. But here we've got this dreadful cholera vibrio. When at last did they know it was polluted water? Well, it was actually identified in the same year that that inspector came to Leeds, and it was found by Dr. Jon Snow, who found out that the cholera bug was spread through contaminated water. And he did that because he found that all the victims could be linked to one pump. But it wasn't until 1883 when the German physician Robert Koch isolated the bacterium and finally discovered the cause of the disease. He determined that it indeed was spread through sanitary water or food supply, and he supported Snow's theory from 20 years earlier. It's a shame, though, that we still have these wretched bugs which affect every element of society. Thank you.